When the hottest weeks of summer arrive, many gardens seem to lose their momentum all at once. Lettuce turns bitter and bolts. Spinach disappears. Garden peas slow down. Some tomato plants keep growing, but drop flowers instead of setting fruit. Containers dry faster, leaves wilt earlier, and the garden that looked full of promise in spring can suddenly feel tired. But that does not mean your growing season is over. It may simply mean the garden is asking for a different group of crops. Okra, southern peas, yardlong beans, eggplant, hot peppers, and several less familiar southern crops are built for conditions that make cool season vegetables struggle. They do not become invincible just because the weather is hot, and extreme heat can still reduce flowering or damage roots. But when you give them enough space, steady moisture, balanced nutrition, and the right harvesting routine, they can turn the hottest part of summer into a second production season. In this video, we are going through 14 crops that can keep giving you food when ordinary spring vegetables slow down. Some produce tender pods, some climb a trellis, some give you fresh leaves when true spinach has already vanished. One spreads across the soil, shades its own root zone, and later gives you an underground harvest. And near the end, we will narrow the entire list down to the best choices for one large container, one trellis, a humid backyard, and a beginner who wants the easiest possible start. But there is one warning you need to hear before planting any of them. A crop can love warm weather and still fail in a small, overheated pot. It can grow huge leaves and almost no food if it receives too much nitrogen. It can produce well for a week and then slow down because mature pods were left hidden on the plant. The crop that looks healthiest is not always the crop feeding you the most. So before we begin with okra, remember 4 simple rules. These rules determine whether a heat-loving crop merely survives or actually produces. The first rule is to protect the root zone. Leaves may enjoy warm air, but roots trapped in a small container can become stressed when the pot heats up and the soil dries from the outside inward. A larger container holds more moisture and changes temperature more slowly. That does not mean you should place every plant in an enormous tub, but it does mean you should avoid forcing a large crop into a pot that can barely hold its roots. When possible, keep containers off dark pavement. Cluster them so they shade one another, or place them where the pot receives a little protection, even while the leaves remain in strong light. The second rule is steady moisture. Heat-loving does not mean drought-proof, especially in containers. A plant that repeatedly swings from soaked soil to bone-dry soil may drop flowers, produce tough fruit, or stop growing. Water slowly enough to moisten the entire root ball. If water runs down the sides and out the drainage holes immediately, the mix may have pulled away from the pot. Apply water in stages so the soil can absorb it again. Check below the surface instead of judging only by the color of the top layer. The third rule is mulch. A modest layer of clean organic mulch can slow evaporation, reduce soil splash, and soften the daily temperature swing around the roots. Keep it slightly away from the main stem so the base of the plant does not remain constantly wet. In a raised bed, mulch can also help stop the surface from forming a hard crust after intense sun or heavy rain. The fourth rule is balanced nutrition. Summer gardeners often see pale leaves or slow growth and immediately add more fertilizer. But too much nitrogen can give you a beautiful wall of foliage with very few flowers. Feed the soil before planting, then respond to the plant instead of feeding on a rigid schedule. A crop carrying flowers and fruit needs enough nutrition to keep producing, but it does not need to be pushed into endless leafy growth. Also, remember that hot and humid is not the same as hot and dry. In a humid climate, crowded leaves, wet foliage, and slow airflow can increase disease pressure. In a dry climate, the main problems may be rapid moisture loss, spider mites, scorched container walls, and soil that becomes difficult to rehydrate. The crop may be the same, but the solution changes with the environment. Before planting, do one more practical test. Count the hours of direct sun, identify the hottest surface around the container, and decide how often you can realistically harvest. A plant that needs frequent picking is a poor match for a garden you only visit once a week. A giant vine is a poor match for a narrow walkway. A long-season crop is a poor match for a region only a few weeks away from frost. Heat tolerance matters, but fit matters just as much. Think in layers. Use an upright crop such as okra, where it will not shade a smaller plant. Put climbers on the north or back side of the garden when possible, so the trellis does not block the strongest light. Let a spreading crop such as sweet potato cover bare soil only where it can be redirected easily. Keep paths open enough to inspect hidden pods, because the harvest you cannot reach is often the harvest that becomes overmature. Start with healthy soil, rather than trying to correct everything after the plants are large. Mix finished compost into the bed, or use a dependable container mix with drainage and water holding capacity. Garden soil alone can become dense in a pot, while an extremely light mix may dry too quickly in exposed summer conditions. The goal is a root zone that drains after watering, but does not become dust a few hours later. Finally, plant for your actual kitchen. A crop can be productive and still be wasted if no one wants to eat it. Decide whether you want tender pods, shell peas, leafy greens, peppers for freezing, or storage crops for later. With those 4 rules in place, we can begin with the plant that defines a hot southern garden, okra. If one crop seems to wake up when summer becomes uncomfortable, it is okra. Okra seedlings may appear slow while the soil is still cool, but once warm conditions settle in, the plants can grow quickly, form flowers along the stem, and produce pods in a steady, upward sequence. The newest flowers and youngest pods are usually near the top, while the oldest pods are lower down. For a traditional green okra, many gardeners know Clemson spineless. Emerald is another familiar green type, with smooth, rounded pods. Gardeners who want a somewhat more compact habit can look for smaller or earlier varieties, such as Annie Oakley types, while red varieties, such as red burgundy, add dramatic color before turning darker during cooking. The best variety is not simply the one with the longest pod or tallest plant. It is the one that fits your season, your container, and the way you plan to use the harvest. Okra needs room. In the ground, give each plant enough spacing for air and access, because harvesting becomes difficult when branches and leaves overlap. In a container, one healthy plant in a generous pot is usually easier to keep productive than several crowded plants competing in a small volume of soil. A tall plant may also need support if wind reaches your patio or if the pot is lightweight. The biggest okra mistake is waiting for every pod to become impressive. A long pod may look like more food, but size is not the same as quality. As a pod matures, the fibers strengthen, the seeds enlarge, and the pod can become difficult to cut. The exact harvest size depends on the variety, so instead of trusting one measurement, learn the feel of your plant. Young pods are generally easy to cut and still have a fresh, flexible appearance. If a pod resists the knife, feels woody, or has been overlooked for too long, remove it anyway so the plant does not keep investing energy in mature seed. During peak production, inspect okra often. Pods can hide behind leaves and appear to change almost overnight. Regular picking keeps the harvest tender and prevents old pods from remaining on the plant. Use clean pruners or a knife if the stems are difficult to snap. Some people are sensitive to the tiny hairs on okra leaves and stems, so gloves and long sleeves can make harvesting more comfortable. Do not confuse temporary afternoon drooping with permanent failure. Large okra leaves may hang down during the hottest part of the day and recover later. Check the plant in the morning. If it is still wilted after the night, investigate the moisture deeper in the soil and look for root stress. If the soil is constantly wet and the plant still looks weak, the problem may be poor drainage rather than lack of water. Okra also shows you when nutrition is out of balance. A plant that grows rapidly but delays flowering may be receiving too much nitrogen or too much shade. A plant that flowers but repeatedly loses tiny pods may be experiencing moisture swings, root restriction, or severe heat at the wrong time. No single cause explains every dropped flower, so look at the whole system before reaching for fertilizer. Okra also gives you a useful pruning option late in a long season. When plants become very tall and production slows, some gardeners cut them back above healthy nodes to encourage new branching. This technique is sometimes called ratooning. It is not necessary in every climate, and it only makes sense when enough warm weather remains for new shoots to develop. If frost is approaching, severe pruning may remove the productive part of the plant without giving it time to recover. If you plan to save seed, choose 1 or 2 healthy pods and allow those specific pods to mature fully near the end of the season. Mark them so they are not accidentally harvested for eating. Seed-saving pods become dry and woody, which is exactly what you do not want for the kitchen, but exactly what you need for mature seed. Keep seed saving separate from your routine harvest so a few old pods do not quietly reduce the tender harvest for weeks. The proof of a productive okra plant is not simply height. The proof is a repeating pattern of flower, young pod, harvest, and new flower farther up the stem. When that cycle continues, the plant is doing its job. Okra may be the symbol of summer, but the next crop offers far more choices in flavor, growth habit, and how you use the harvest. That brings us to southern peas and cowpeas, a group gardeners often mistake for several unrelated crops. Southern peas are cowpeas, and names such as black-eyed pea, purple hull pea, crowder pea, and cream pea describe different types within that broad group. They may differ in seed color, pod color, flavor, texture, maturity, and growth habit, but they share the warm season character that makes cowpeas so valuable in hot gardens. Before buying seed, check whether the variety grows as a bush, a semi-vining plant, or a vigorous vine. A bush type fits more easily into a raised bed or a wide container. A semi-vining type may sprawl between neighboring plants and needs more room than the seedling suggests. A climbing type can use a fence or trellis, but it should receive that support early, before the stems tangle across the ground. Cowpeas are often described as tolerant of heat and short dry periods once established, but that description can mislead container gardeners. A rooted plant in open soil can explore a much larger area for moisture than a plant in a pot. In a container, cowpeas still need regular monitoring. If the pot becomes completely dry while the plant is flowering, pod set and pod fill can suffer. These legumes also demonstrate why more fertilizer is not always better. A rich dose of nitrogen can produce vigorous vines with fewer pods than expected. Prepare the soil with compost. Avoid excessive feeding, and pay attention to flowering. When the plants are green, growing and blooming, do not keep pushing them with nitrogen simply because summer crops look hungry in the heat. The harvest stage depends on what you want to eat. Some varieties can be picked young for tender pods, although not every southern pea is best used that way. For fresh shell peas, wait until the seeds have filled the pod but the pod has not completely dried. For storage, allow the pods to mature and dry as weather permits. Then shell and dry the peas properly before storing them. This flexibility is one reason southern peas have remained so useful in hot regions. Watch the pods closely. Stink bugs and other sap-feeding insects may damage developing seeds without making the whole plant look unhealthy. Aphids may gather on tender growth, especially when ants are moving up and down the stems. Instead of spraying the entire garden automatically, inspect the youngest leaves, flowers, and pods, and respond to what you actually find. You can also use southern peas to fill a bed after an early crop is finished, provided enough warm season remains. Their roots and dense canopy help occupy open soil, but do not treat them as a complete fertilizer program for the next crop. Legumes can contribute to a rotation, yet the amount of nitrogen left for future plants depends on how the crop is managed and how much plant material is removed. Grow them primarily because you want the harvest, and view soil benefits as an additional advantage rather than a guaranteed replacement for compost or fertilizer. At the kitchen stage, harvest timing changes texture. Freshly shelled peas are plump and tender. Fully dried peas store longer but need more cooking. Purple hull and crowder types may have very different flavors and seed textures, so trying 2 varieties in separate rows can teach you more than planting a large amount of one unfamiliar type. Southern peas are especially good for gardeners who want a crop that can be eaten fresh, shelled, cooked, frozen, or dried. They also give you a choice between a compact plant and a climbing one. If you only have a wide container, a bush type is the simpler option. If you have a sunny fence, a vining type can convert unused vertical space into a productive wall. If you want the warm weather strength of cowpeas but need a crop that climbs upward and produces long, tender pods, the next plant is built for that job. Yardlong beans are closely related to cowpeas, and that family connection helps explain why they often perform when ordinary green beans begin to slow down in persistent heat. Yardlong beans need a trellis, and they need it early. The vines can grow quickly once established, and trying to untangle them after they have wrapped around railings, tomato cages, or nearby crops is frustrating. Give them a tall, stable structure with easy access from both sides if possible. On a balcony, secure the trellis against wind and make sure the mature vine will not block a doorway or overwhelm a weaker plant. A large container can support a small number of vines, but the root zone must remain evenly moist. Because the foliage sits high in the sun, the plant may lose water quickly, even when the pot surface still appears damp. Feel the mix below the mulch and water deeply when needed. Avoid letting the roots sit in stagnant water, especially in humid climates. The dramatic length of the pods creates the main harvesting trap. Do not wait for every bean to reach its maximum possible size. Yardlong beans are usually best while the pods remain slender, flexible, and relatively smooth, before the seeds create large bumps. Once the pod becomes pale, puffy, or tough, quality declines. Pick frequently, because regular harvesting encourages the vine to continue flowering instead of directing all its energy toward mature seed. Yardlong beans can hide in foliage, even though they are long. Look behind leaves and along the inner side of the trellis. A missed pod can become thick and mature, while younger pods are still perfect. Remove old pods and keep the growing tips directed onto the support. Aphids may gather on the tender tips, and ants may reveal their presence. Spider mites can become a problem in hot, dry conditions, especially on dusty leaves. Good airflow, regular inspection, and avoiding severe drought stress help the plants remain resilient. Pollination is another reason to keep the vine accessible. Yardlong bean flowers can be partly hidden by foliage, and dense growth may reduce air movement. Avoid turning the trellis into an impenetrable wall. Guide wandering stems, remove clearly dead material, and keep enough space to see the flowers and pods. A tidy trellis is not only attractive, it makes harvesting frequent enough to maintain quality. Yardlong beans are one of the strongest choices when your garden has more height than floor space. They are not the best choice if you cannot provide a trellis, but with one large pot and a secure vertical structure, they can turn a narrow, sunny area into a productive summer zone. The next bean does not produce the same dramatic pods, but it offers something yardlong beans do not: large, substantial seeds for fresh eating or preserving. That crop is the lima bean. Lima beans come in bush and climbing forms. Bush types mature in a more compact space and may be easier for container or small bed gardeners. Pole types can continue growing and producing over a longer period, but they need a strong trellis and a long enough season. Read the variety description carefully, because a seed packet labeled lima bean does not tell you whether the plant will remain compact. Warm conditions support lima bean growth, but no flowering crop benefits from unlimited heat. During severe hot spells, especially when nights remain very warm, flowers may fail to set. The best response is not heavy feeding. Keep the soil evenly moist, protect the root zone with mulch, and allow the plant to resume production when conditions become less stressful. In humid areas, give climbing lima beans enough space for air to move through the vines. Water the soil rather than soaking the leaves late in the day. In dry areas, monitor for mites and do not let the root zone repeatedly collapse into drought while pods are filling. For fresh shell beans, harvest when the pods look full and the seeds inside have developed, but before the pods become completely dry and brittle. If you want dried beans, allow them to mature fully when weather permits. Lima beans should be cooked properly and not eaten raw. That is a simple but important food safety rule. Lima beans are not always as fast or visually dramatic as yardlong beans, but they add a different kind of value. They provide a richer shelling harvest, and pole forms can use a summer trellis for a long period. Choose them when you want substantial seeds rather than tender pods. Beans can fill a trellis, but the next plant can give a container garden large, glossy fruit through the hottest part of the season. It is time to leave the bean family and move to one of summer's most dependable fruiting crops, eggplant. Eggplant usually becomes far more enthusiastic after the weather warms. The plants appreciate heat, and many varieties continue growing through conditions that make cool season crops disappear. But variety choice matters. A full-sized traditional eggplant can become wide and heavy, while many Asian, slender-fruited, or compact varieties fit containers more comfortably and begin producing manageable fruit sooner. For container growing, use a generous pot with strong drainage and usually one plant per container. A single healthy eggplant can form a broad canopy and a heavy crop, so crowding several plants together often creates moisture competition and poor airflow. Add a stake or small cage before the branches are loaded with fruit. Supporting the plant early is easier than lifting branches after they bend. The plant needs nutrition, but it is easy to overfeed. If an eggplant has huge dark leaves and few flowers, stop assuming that more fertilizer will solve the problem. Check sunlight, root space, and the amount of nitrogen already present. Once flowering begins, the goal is steady growth, not a sudden burst of foliage. Water deeply enough to keep the root zone stable. Repeated drought can cause flowers to drop and fruit to develop unevenly. At the same time, constantly saturated soil can damage roots. A well-drained mix, a large enough pot, and mulch create a much more forgiving system than frequent shallow watering. Harvest eggplant while the skin remains glossy and the fruit feels firm but not hard. A dull surface, tough skin, and large hard seeds often indicate that the fruit has remained too long. Use pruners and leave a short stem attached rather than twisting the fruit, because the branches can split. Wear gloves around varieties with sharp calyxes or small spines. Flea beetles may create many small holes in young leaves, while spider mites can cause pale stippling during hot, dry weather. Do not remove every damaged leaf from a mature plant. The foliage shades developing fruit, and excessive pruning can expose it to sunscald. Remove only what is necessary for health and airflow. Eggplant flowers may benefit from gentle movement when pollinator activity is low. Usually wind and insects are enough, but a light tap on the support can help release pollen without damaging the blossom. Do this during the cooler part of the day and avoid rough handling. If the plant repeatedly flowers without fruit, first check heat stress, moisture, and nutrition before assuming that pollination alone is the problem. Fruit load also changes watering needs. A plant carrying several developing eggplants can use moisture faster than it did during early vegetative growth. Continue checking the soil rather than relying on the schedule you used when the plant was small. Eggplant is an excellent choice for someone with one large sunny container who wants repeated harvests rather than a single final crop. Compact varieties are easier for patios, while long-fruited types can be harvested young and often. Eggplant loves warmth, but the next crop gives you one of the widest choices in size, flavor, and heat tolerance. From mild frying peppers to intensely hot varieties, peppers can become some of the longest producing plants in a summer container garden. Hot peppers often cope with warm conditions better than large bell peppers, partly because their smaller fruit requires less time and energy to mature. That does not mean every hot pepper loves extreme afternoon heat. Plants can still drop blossoms during severe stress, especially when the root zone is dry or the nights remain unusually warm. Choose a variety that can mature within your season. Some compact peppers remain tidy in containers, while larger types can form woody, branching plants that need support. A medium to large pot with good drainage works well for one plant. Keep the soil evenly moist, but do not water automatically every day without checking. A pot in full sun may need frequent water during 1 week, and far less after rain or a change in temperature. Once the plant has developed a healthy canopy, avoid feeding it repeatedly with high nitrogen fertilizer. A pepper covered in leaves, but carrying few flowers, is not necessarily hungry. It may need more light, more stable moisture, or simply a break from the most intense heat. You can harvest many hot peppers green, which allows the plant to redirect energy toward new flowers and fruit. Allowing peppers to ripen fully produces deeper color and often a more developed flavor. but it also keeps each fruit on the plant longer. If your goal is continuous production, harvest some green and let others ripen, so the plant is not carrying every fruit to full maturity at the same time. Watch for aphids on new growth, whiteflies under leaves, and sun-scald on fruit suddenly exposed after pruning. During an exceptional heat event, light afternoon shade can reduce stress, especially for plants in containers surrounded by reflective walls or pavement. The goal is not to turn a sun-loving pepper into a shade plant. It is to prevent a temporary extreme from damaging flowers, fruit, and roots. Pepper fruit can also be preserved in several ways, which makes a productive plant especially useful. Depending on the variety, peppers can be frozen, dried, pickled, or cooked into sauces. Wear gloves when handling very hot types, avoid touching your face, and keep concentrated pepper oils away from children and pets. The hottest varieties require careful kitchen handling even when the garden work seems simple. At this point, you may think choosing a heat-loving crop solves the entire problem. This is where many summer gardens quietly fail. A heat-loving plant can still stop producing when the roots overheat, when the soil moves from saturated to bone dry, when nitrogen drives foliage instead of flowers, or when old fruit remains hidden on the plant. These four mistakes can affect every crop we have discussed. First, inspect the container itself. A small, dark pot sitting on concrete may become far hotter than the surrounding air. If the plant wilts every afternoon and the mix dries within hours, move the pot onto a lighter surface, shade the container wall, group it with other pots, or transfer the plant to a larger container when practical. Do not suddenly bury a stressed plant in a much larger wet pot without careful watering, but recognize when the current root space has become the limiting factor. Second, correct the watering pattern. If the soil is dry only on top, the plant may not need water yet. If the mix has shrunk away from the sides, one quick pour may escape without wetting the root ball. Water slowly, pause, and water again. In humid climates, make sure excess water drains and the roots receive oxygen. In dry climates, focus on fully rehydrating the mix and slowing evaporation. Third, stop treating fertilizer as an emergency drink. Fertilizer salts can increase stress in dry soil, and nitrogen cannot replace water or root space. Feed when the plant is actively growing and the soil is moist, using a balanced approach suited to the crop and the product label. Do not apply a strong dose to a severely wilted plant in the hottest part of the day. Fourth, harvest on time. Old okra pods, mature beans, oversized cucumbers, dull eggplants, and fully ripened peppers all signal the plant to invest energy in existing fruit and seed. Some fruit should be allowed to mature when that is your goal, but if you want repeated tender harvests, do not leave every fruit on the plant indefinitely. Now that the root zone is protected and the production cycle is clear, we can solve the hardest summer problem of all: how to keep harvesting fresh, green leaves. The first leafy solution climbs instead of forming a low rosette, and that is exactly why it handles summer differently from true spinach. Malabar spinach is not true spinach. It is a warm season vine with thick, glossy leaves and succulent stems, and it often begins growing rapidly after ordinary spinach has already bolted. Malabar spinach needs support. Give it a trellis, fence, or arch, and guide the first stems before they sprawl across neighboring plants. The vine can become vigorous in warm, humid weather, so do not place it where it will smother a small pepper or shade an entire container garden. One strong plant can cover a surprising amount of vertical space. The leaves have a moist, slightly mucilaginous texture when cooked, so they do not behave exactly like regular spinach. That difference is part of their value. The thick leaves resist heat and continue producing when delicate, cool season greens become difficult. Harvest the young tips and tender leaves. Cutting the tips encourages branching and creates more harvest points. Do not strip every mature leaf from the vine. Leave enough foliage for photosynthesis and take smaller harvests regularly. If you want the leaves tender, keep the plant growing steadily with moisture and nutrition, rather than allowing it to become repeatedly drought-stressed. Malabar spinach can grow in a large container, but the pot must support both the roots and the trellis. A top-heavy vine in a lightweight pot can fall during a storm. Secure the support independently when possible. Green-stemmed and red-stemmed forms both create a lush, edible screen, with the red type adding striking color. As the season progresses, the plant may flower and form dark berries. Those berries can stain, and the plant may reseed in suitable climates. Harvest regularly and manage the vine before it becomes a permanent surprise in areas where winters are mild. If you want a heat-loving green without a climbing vine, the next plant spreads outward and can be harvested repeatedly. New Zealand spinach is another plant whose common name hides the fact that it is not true spinach. New Zealand spinach grows as a low, branching plant that spreads across the soil rather than climbing a trellis. It works well along the edge of a raised bed, in a wide container, or in a spot where it can fill open ground without covering small seedlings. Because it sprawls, spacing matters more than the young plant suggests. The seeds can be slow or uneven to germinate. Soaking them before sowing may help soften the outer covering, but warmth and patience are still important. Once established, the plant handles warm weather far better than true spinach. Harvest the tender tips and young leaves. Pinching the tips encourages branching, which gives you more soft growth. Older stems can become tougher, so repeated light harvesting is usually better than waiting and cutting the entire plant at once. Steady moisture improves leaf quality. The plant may tolerate short dry periods, but a container that becomes repeatedly dry can produce smaller, firmer leaves. Give it good drainage and enough root space to spread. Because the plant contains natural compounds common in several leafy greens, it is generally used cooked and eaten as part of a varied diet rather than treated as an unlimited raw snack. New Zealand spinach is valuable for gardeners who want a low-growing summer green and do not have room for a tall trellis. But the next crop offers even more possibilities. It can provide tender leaves, dramatic color, and, in the right variety, grain. Amaranth is a broad group, and the first step is choosing a type intended for the harvest you want. Some varieties are grown mainly for edible leaves. Others are selected for grain or ornamental color. Do not assume that every volunteer amaranth or weedy relative should be harvested from an unknown location. Start with seed, sold for edible use, and identify the plant correctly. Leaf amaranth grows quickly in warm weather. The youngest leaves and tips are usually the most tender. Pinching the top encourages side branches and delays the plant from becoming one tall, woody stem. For a steady supply, sow a small new patch periodically, instead of depending on one old planting for the entire season. Amaranth can grow in containers, but a deep pot is better for upright varieties, and a group of plants will use water quickly. If you grow it as baby leaves, closer spacing is possible because the plants are harvested young. If you want mature leaves or grain, provide more room and stronger roots. Red, green, and multicolored varieties can make a summer bed visually impressive while still producing food. However, some amaranths self-seed aggressively. Harvest flower heads before seed scatters if you do not want volunteers throughout the garden. In areas where related species are troublesome weeds, manage the crop carefully. The next southern plant also gives you edible leaves, but its most recognizable harvest comes later in the form of deep red calices. That plant is roselle, a heat-loving member of the hibiscus family. Roselle begins as an innocent-looking seedling and can become a large branching plant. Give it more space than you think it needs. In a container, use a very large pot and expect frequent watering. In the ground, leave enough distance between plants for air to move, especially in hot, humid regions where crowded foliage remains wet. Depending on the variety and local use, young leaves can be cooked or added for a tart flavor. The famous later harvest is the fleshy red calyx that forms around the seed capsule after flowering. Those calyces are used in teas, sauces, preserves, and other preparations. Roselle needs a long, warm season to reach its full potential. In regions with an early first frost, the plant may grow beautifully, but run out of time before producing a large calyx harvest. Check the expected maturity and your local frost window before giving it valuable space. This is especially important because a mature roselle plant is not a compact balcony crop. Do not overfeed roselle with nitrogen. A giant leafy plant may delay the reproductive stage you are waiting for. Keep the growth steady, maintain moisture, and allow the plant enough sun and space. Inspect young leaves for aphids and chewing insects, and avoid keeping the center of the plant constantly wet in humid conditions. Roselle rises above the garden, but the next crop travels in the opposite direction. It covers the soil, shades its own root zone, gives you edible young leaves, and later produces an underground harvest. That living ground cover is the sweet potato. Sweet potatoes begin from slips, which are rooted shoots rather than pieces of a grocery store potato. Once the weather and soil are warm, the vines can spread quickly. That canopy shades the ground, reduces some weed pressure, and protects the soil surface from direct sun. In a raised bed, the vines may run beyond their assigned area, so guide them before they bury smaller crops. For container growing, use a wide, deep grow bag or a generous pot filled with loose, well-drained soil. A tiny container may produce an impressive vine, but leave little room for storage roots to expand. Do not pack the mix tightly, and avoid soil that stays waterlogged after every irrigation. The same nitrogen warning applies here. A sweet potato can produce a beautiful jungle of vines while making fewer or smaller roots when growth is pushed too hard. Use compost and balanced nutrition, but do not chase leaf size with constant high nitrogen feeding. Sweet potato leaves and tender tips are edible when correctly identified, unlike the leaves of ordinary potatoes. But if your main goal is a large root harvest, do not repeatedly strip the vines. Take a modest number of tips and leave enough foliage to feed the developing storage roots. The crop needs a sufficiently long warm season. Before planting late, compare the variety's maturity range with the time remaining before your first frost. At harvest, dig carefully, because fresh roots bruise and scrape easily. Proper curing later improves storage quality, but the most important summer task is giving the plant loose soil, enough time, and restrained nitrogen. Sweet potato vines can also be lifted and redirected without burying every node. Allowing many sections of vine to root along the ground can make the bed harder to manage and may spread the plant beyond its intended area. Gently turn the vines back toward their space rather than cutting them repeatedly. The objective is to keep a healthy leaf canopy while preserving access to paths and neighboring crops. Sweet potatoes solve the ground cover problem. The next crop solves the cucumber problem when ordinary cucumbers begin struggling in persistent heat. Despite its name, the Armenian cucumber is actually a type of muskmelon grown and eaten like a cucumber. That botanical difference helps explain its distinctive behavior. Armenian cucumber vines appreciate warm conditions and can continue growing through summer when some common cucumber varieties become stressed. The vines are vigorous, so give them a strong trellis or enough ground to travel. A trellis makes the fruit easier to find, keeps it cleaner, and often helps it grow straighter. Secure the support because the vine and fruit can become heavy. In a container, use a large pot and maintain even moisture. A small dry pot may cause misshapen fruit, bitter flavor, or interrupted growth even though the plant itself loves warmth. The main harvesting lesson is the same one we saw with Yardlong beans and okra. Do not chase maximum size. Armenian cucumbers can become very long, but the best eating quality usually comes while the skin is tender, the seeds are soft, and the fruit still feels crisp. A giant fruit may be useful for seed saving or specific recipes, but it is not automatically the best harvest. Check the vine frequently, because fruit can hide behind leaves. Pick with pruners instead of pulling on the stem. Good airflow helps in humid climates, while mulch and deep watering are critical in dry ones. Watch for aphids, squash bugs, and leaf diseases, and avoid crowding the vine with several other large cucurbits on one small trellis. The next crop looks like a tomato relative, because it is one, but it needs a planting strategy that surprises many beginners. To get a dependable tomatillo harvest, one plant is usually not the best plan. Tomatillos form small, lantern-like husks around the fruit. Many varieties benefit from cross-pollination between separate plants, so planting at least 2 compatible plants is a safer approach than depending on one isolated plant. That requirement immediately changes the container plan. Tomatillo is not the ideal crop for someone who has room for only one small pot. The plants can grow broad and branch heavily. Give them space, a cage, or strong stakes. Two plants in separate large containers may be easier to manage than two crowded into one pot. Pollinator activity is important, so avoid spraying open flowers unnecessarily and include flowering plants nearby when possible. Keep the soil evenly moist while the plants flower and fill fruit. Too much nitrogen can again create a large leafy plant with delayed fruiting. When the husk is filled and begins to split or become papery, the fruit is usually approaching harvest. Depending on the variety, ripe fruit may remain green, turn yellowish, or develop a purple blush. Inspect tomatillos for flea beetles, aphids, and hornworms. A plant can look vigorous while pests quietly damage new growth. Because the canopy becomes dense, look inside the plant rather than checking only the outer leaves. Tomatillo is a strong choice for a gardener who has room for multiple plants and wants a steady supply for salsa and cooking. It is a weak choice for a tiny balcony with space for one container. That honesty matters. Not every heat crop belongs in every garden. Our final crop is the largest and most demanding on the list, but it may also be one of the best examples of a plant adapted to a long, humid southern summer. For gardeners with room to let a vine travel, the final choice is Seminole pumpkin. Seminole pumpkin has a long history in Florida and is known for vigorous vines, useful fruit, and an ability to perform in warm, humid conditions. But do not interpret that reputation as immunity from every problem. The vines still need fertility, moisture, pollination, airflow, and protection from severe pest pressure. This is not a compact container crop. The vine can travel across a large bed, climb a sturdy fence, or be trained onto a strong structure. Give it space where it will not smother peppers, herbs, or young vegetables. If you let it climb, make sure the support can carry mature vines and fruit. Keep developing fruit off constantly wet soil when possible by using a dry board, tile, or thick mulch beneath it. Inspect stems and leaf bases for squash vine borer damage where that pest is active. Watch for squash bugs and remove clusters of eggs early. In humid weather, encourage airflow and avoid unnecessary leaf wetness. Seminole pumpkin requires time. It is best suited to a long growing season and gardeners who can dedicate real space to it. The reward is mature fruit with hard skin and good storage potential when harvested and cured correctly. Compared with a compact pepper, it is demanding. Compared with an empty patch of hot ground, it can become a productive summer canopy. You now have all 14 crops, but the best choice depends on whether you have one pot, one trellis, a humid backyard, or an entire bed to fill. For the best overall symbol of summer heat production, choose okra. It is straightforward, highly visible, and rewards frequent harvesting. For a wide container or a raised bed, choose a bush southern pea that matches your preferred use. For a trellis, Yardlong beans offer tender pods and strong vertical growth. For one large container and repeated fruit, compact eggplant or a hot pepper is often easier than a giant vine. Eggplant gives you substantial fruit, while peppers offer more flexibility in plant size, flavor, and harvest stage. If you want leafy greens from a trellis, Malabar spinach is the clear choice. If you want a low-growing leafy plant, choose New Zealand spinach. For a fast, colorful summer leaf crop, choose an edible amaranth variety. For a living ground cover with a later root harvest, choose sweet potato. For a large plant and a late red calyx harvest in a long season, choose roselle. For a cucumber-like summer fruit on a trellis, choose Armenian cucumber. Tomatillo belongs in a garden with room for at least 2 plants and active pollinators. Seminole pumpkin belongs in a large space with a long season and a strong structure or open ground. Neither is a fair recommendation for a balcony gardener with one small pot. If you live in a hot, humid climate, prioritize airflow, drainage, disease monitoring, and varieties known to perform in your region. If you garden in hot, dry conditions, prioritize large containers, deep watering, mulch, protection from reflected heat, and early detection of spider mites. In either climate, Check your local planting window and first frost date before starting a long season crop late in summer. When making the final choice, include your harvesting schedule in the decision. Okra and Yardlong beans reward frequent inspection. Sweet potatoes can wait for a final harvest, but demand months of space. Roselle asks for patience before the cowpeas arrive. Peppers and eggplants offer more flexibility because you can often harvest at several stages. Matching the crop to your routine prevents a productive plant from becoming a source of overgrown, wasted food. A simple 3-crop plan is often stronger than a crowded 14-crop experiment. Select 1 vertical crop, 1 compact fruiting crop, and 1 leafy or ground cover crop. This gives you different harvests without making every plant compete for the same layer of light and soil. Most importantly, do not try to grow all 14 simply because they are on a list. Choose 3 that solve different problems. You might grow okra for repeated pods, Yardlong beans for vertical production, and Malabar spinach for summer greens. Or you might choose a hot pepper for 1 container, sweet potato for ground cover, and southern peas for fresh and dried harvests. A productive summer garden is not created by fighting the heat. It is created by changing the garden to match the season. Choose crops that belong in warm conditions. Protect the roots even when the leaves love the sun. Keep moisture steady. Feed for flowers and fruit, not just foliage. And harvest before yesterday's pod becomes tomorrow's problem. When you do that, the hottest weeks of summer stop looking like the end of the garden. They become the beginning of a completely different harvest season.